The rain-soaked streets of the city hid a secret he never imagined he would find again. In a flash between rain and chaos, he saw three little faces identical to his own, and a woman fleeing with fear in her eyes. Each step toward the truth unearthed lies buried by his own family. But now, facing a past that has returned with force, he will do everything to reclaim what was stolen from him, love and his daughters. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. And now on with the story. The rain was coming down hard over New York City that Thursday night, turning the streets of Park Avenue into grey mirrors that reflected the lights of the corporate towers. Inside a black Audi, Ryan Anderson watched the gridlocked traffic with the same empty expression he always wore, his tie perfectly knotted, his Italian suit impeccable, the hands of his Swiss watch marking 11 o'clock. Just another day, like the last 2,000. Just another night going home alone to the penthouse apartment that never really felt like home. The driver, Joe, a man in his 60s who had worked for the Anderson family for over 3 decades, drove in respectful silence. He knew his boss's silence all too well, that way of looking out the window without really seeing anything, as if he were always searching for something he could never find. Ryan was 34, the CEO of the Anderson Group, a financial conglomerate that moved billions, but Joe had always thought the young man carried a weight on his shoulders that no amount of money could lift. 6 years. It had been exactly 6 years since that morning when Ryan woke, up to find only a note on the dresser. A few words, shaky handwriting, no real explanation. Sarah had vanished from his life as if she had never existed, taking with her all the plans they had made, the apartment they were furnishing together, the wedding dress she had chosen with such care. All that was left was the pain, and over time Ryan had turned that pain into something useful, into obsessive work, into numbers, spreadsheets, meetings that stretched into the early hours. He had transformed abandonment into calculated coldness. His father, Arthur Anderson, had always said that relationship was a dangerous distraction. Sarah was too simple, came from a family with no social standing, worked as an art teacher in a public school in the Bronx. To the patriarch, she represented everything an heir shouldn't want, everything that could weaken the empire built with so much sacrifice. When Sarah disappeared, Arthur never said the words out loud, but Ryan felt his father's quiet relief. That way he'd touch on the subject like someone removing an annoying splinter. Over time, Ryan stopped talking about Sarah, stopped looking for her, stopped feeling, or at least pretended he had. The car slowed as it passed through a less crowded area near the Lower East Side. The rain was heavier now, drumming on the roof of the car like impatient fingers. It was then that Ryan saw, through the fogged-up window, a scene that made his heart pound in a way it hadn't in years. On the sidewalk, precariously sheltered by a blue plastic tarp tied between 2 light poles, was a woman hugging 3 little girls. The children, who looked to be between 5 and 6 years old, were huddled against their mother's body, their simple clothes soaked, their small faces hidden against her chest. The woman's brown hair was plastered to her face by the rain, her shoulders hunched in a protective stance, as if her body were the only barrier between her daughters and the world. Ryan felt a strange tightness in his chest. Without thinking, without calculating, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He acted on impulse. He asked Joe to stop the car. The driver obeyed, surprised, pulling over a few yards ahead. Ryan got out of the car, the rain immediately drenching his expensive suit, and walked back to the sidewalk where the woman and the girls were sheltering. Each step felt like it weighed a ton. Something about that scene pulled him with an inexplicable force, as if a dormant part of him recognized something before his conscious mind could process it. When he got closer, the girls lifted their frightened little faces. They were triplets, identical in every detail, with the same almond-shaped eyes, the same arched eyebrows, the same facial structure. Ryan felt the ground disappear from under his feet. Those eyes, that face shape, it was like looking at 3 miniature versions of himself. Before he could fully process the shock, the woman lifted her head and Ryan's world stopped spinning. Sarah. Her face was thinner, marked by time and hardship, but it was unmistakably her. The same green eyes that had made him believe in true love, the same mouth he had kissed 1,000 times, promising a future that never came. For an infinite second they just stared at each other, the rain falling between them like a liquid curtain separating two worlds. Ryan saw something in her eyes that cut him deeper than any abandonment. Pure fear. Not the surprise of a reunion, not joy, not shame. Just fear. Sarah pulled the girls tightly to her, standing up abruptly. The children protested, confused, but she didn't let go of their wrists. She started walking quickly down the sidewalk, almost running, looking back as if fleeing from a deadly threat. Ryan tried to follow her, tried to call her name, but his voice came out weak, muffled by the sound of the rain and traffic. He saw Sarah and the three girls turn a corner, disappearing into the crowd sheltering under awnings and at bus stops. He tried to run, but his executive feet in their Italian shoes slipped on the wet sidewalk. When he finally reached the corner, they were completely gone, swallowed by the night and the rain of the big city. Joe appeared at his side, holding an umbrella, but Ryan didn't even notice. He was just standing there, trembling, not from the cold but from shock. On the wet ground, half hidden under a soaked piece of cardboard, he saw a colourful children's blanket with a pattern of stars and moons. He picked up the wet fabric with trembling hands, feeling its weight, its reality. It hadn't been a hallucination. Sarah was alive. Sarah was in New York, and Sarah had 3 daughters who were unmistakably his. The walk back to the car was a blur. Joe drove to the apartment without asking any questions, but Ryan could feel the old driver's worried gaze in the rearview mirror. When he finally arrived at the luxurious penthouse on the Upper East Side, with its designer furniture and panoramic view of the illuminated city, Ryan couldn't do anything but sit on the living room floor, still in his wetsuit, clutching the children's blanket to his chest. The tears came without permission, breaking the dam of 6 years of forced coldness. He cried for the Sarah he had loved, for the Sarah who had abandoned him, for the Sarah who had just run from him as if he were a monster. He cried for the 3 identical girls who were his daughters and whom he had never known. He cried for the man he had become, so hard and so empty that he no longer recognized himself. He stayed awake all night, sitting in that huge, cold room, reliving every moment of the encounter. The girls had his eyes, his facial structure, even the furrowed their brows when they were scared was just like his. How had Sarah managed to hide a pregnancy with triplets? Where had she been all these years? Why had she run from him that night, 6 years ago, leaving only a vague note about not being able to go on, about him deserving better? And why, when they finally met again, had she run as if he were a threat? When the sun began to rise, painting the New York sky with shades of pink and orange, Ryan made a decision. No matter how long it took, no matter what he had to do, he was going to find Sarah again. He was going to find his daughters. He was going to find out the truth about what had happened 6 years ago, and this time he wouldn't let her disappear without an explanation. The next morning, he arrived at the office 2 hours late, something absolutely unheard of for Ryan Anderson, the executive known for arriving before everyone and leaving after everyone. His secretary, Patricia, an efficient woman in her 50s who had worked with him for a decade, noticed immediately that something was wrong. His eyes were red. He hadn't shaved. His tie was crooked. During the board meeting, Ryan barely paid attention to the presentations on quarterly results. The numbers that had always been his anchor, his comfort zone, now seemed like meaningless scribbles on a screen. His mind was stuck on that wet sidewalk, on those 3 scared little faces, on Sarah's fear-filled gaze. Arthur Anderson, sitting at the head of the conference table with his impeccable posture and his custom-tailored suit, noticed his son's distraction. At the end of the meeting, he called Ryan into his office, a room dominated by dark wood, old, paintings and trophies from a career built on strategic alliances and cold decisions. The patriarch poured them both a scotch, even though it was only 10 in the morning, and asked directly what was going on. Ryan almost told him. He almost let it slip about seeing Sarah, about the triplets, about the upheaval that had shattered his already fragile peace of mind. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of how his father had always spoken of Sarah with disdain. Maybe it was the instinct that there were bigger secrets hidden in this story. He just answered that he was tired, that he needed a few days to handle some personal matters. Arthur looked at his son with that calculating expression he always used before making important business decisions. He said that exhaustion was for weak people, that an Anderson couldn't afford to falter, especially now that the company was in the middle of delicate negotiations with international investors. Ryan nodded in agreement, but inside, a dull anger began to grow. Did his father really think he was just an extension of the company, just a piece on the business chessboard? He left that office with an unsettling certainty. He couldn't tell his father about Sarah. Not yet. Not before he understood what had really happened. During lunch, instead of going to the executive restaurant where he always ate, Ryan asked Joe to speak with him privately. The driver was more than an employee. He was almost like an uncle, someone who had watched Ryan grow up, who had been there for moments his own father had missed while being too busy building the empire. He told the old driver everything. The reunion with Sarah, the triplets, her escape, the fear in her eyes. Joe listened in. Silence, nodding slowly, as if he were putting together the pieces of a puzzle he always knew existed, but had never seen whole. When Ryan finished, Joe was silent for a long moment, looking at his own calloused hands on the steering wheel. Finally, he said something that made Ryan's heart clench. He said he'd always found it strange how Sarah had disappeared so suddenly, without any fights or signs. He said that at the time, he'd overheard conversations at the office, comments from secretaries about the pretty girl young Ryan had brought to meet old Arthur, about how the patriarch hadn't liked the relationship at all. He said that right after Sarah's disappearance, he'd seen the family's private lawyer coming and going from his boss's office with unusual frequency. But they were just impressions, nothing concrete. Just a feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. Could his father have had something to do with Sarah's disappearance? The idea seemed absurd, but at the same time it made a disturbing kind of sense. Arthur Anderson was a man who treated obstacles as problems to be solved, and Sarah had always been seen by him as exactly that, an obstacle to the plans he had for his son. But what exactly could his father have done? Threatened Sarah? Offered her money to leave? Ryan's mind began to churn with increasingly dark possibilities. He asked Joe for a favor he knew was delicate but necessary. He needed to find Sarah and the girls. The driver had contacts, knew people at shelters, churches, social services around the city. If Sarah was homeless with 3 small children, someone had to know something. Joe promised to use his contacts discreetly, without drawing attention, without involving the Anderson family name. Ryan thanked him with a sincerity he hadn't shown in years, gripping the old driver's shoulder as if he were holding onto a life raft in a stormy sea. In the following days, Ryan tried to maintain his routine, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. He attended meetings without really listening, signed contracts without really reading, smiled at clients without really being present. At night, he would return to the empty apartment and stare for hours at the children's blanket he had kept as proof that the encounter had been real. He found himself imagining what his daughters were like. What were their names? What did they like to play with? Were they happy, even living on the streets? Or did their little eyes carry the same sadness he saw reflected in the mirror every morning? Patricia, his secretary, started asking veiled questions. She asked if he was sick, if something had happened in the family, if he needed help. Ryan said everything was fine, but they both knew it was a lie. Even the partners started to notice. In an important meeting with European investors, Ryan completely lost. His train of thought in the middle of a presentation, standing in silence for long seconds before composing himself. The embarrassment was palpable. Arthur, present at the meeting, had to intervene to save the situation, and the look he shot his son afterward was as sharp as a blade. That night Arthur showed up at Ryan's apartment unannounced, something he rarely did. Father and son sat on the balcony, the illuminated city stretching out below them like a carpet of artificial stars. The patriarch got straight to the point. He asked if Ryan was on drugs, if he'd gotten involved in some scandal, if he was sick. Ryan almost laughed at the irony. His father was worried about scandals, about the family's image, about the business. He never asked if his son was happy, if he was fulfilled. if he felt the affectionless life he led was worth anything beyond the zeros in his bank account. He replied that it was nothing like that he was just tired, that he would pull himself together. Arthur didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Before leaving, however, he said something that echoed in Ryan's mind for hours. He said that a man in their position couldn't afford to have weaknesses, that the business world was ruthless with those who showed vulnerability. He said that Ryan needed to forget the past, focus on the future, find a suitable woman from an important family, and build the life the Anderson name demanded. His father's words sounded like a sentence, as if Ryan's life was already written and all he had to do was follow the script. After his father left, Ryan sat in the dark living room for hours. He thought about Sarah, about how she had been the only person who made him feel like he could be himself, without the weight of his last name, without the expectations, without the coldness his family demanded. He thought about the triplets, the daughters he didn't know, who carried half his DNA but lived as if he didn't exist. He thought about the man he had become, this successful executive who, deep down, was nothing but an empty shell, running on autopilot, following orders, meeting others' expectations. It was then, at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, that his phone rang. It was Joe. The driver had found a lead. The morning arrived with a grey sky over New York, the kind of day where it feels like the whole city is holding its breath, waiting for the rain to return. Ryan had barely slept, but he'd been in Joe's car since 6 in the morning, driving toward the Bronx, to a neighborhood he had never visited before. The driver had gotten a tip from an acquaintance who worked in social services. A woman with triplets had sought help at a community shelter near Van Cortlandt Park. The description matched, Sarah and the girls. The drive was long, passing through increasingly modest parts of the city, where the mirrored skyscrapers of Midtown gave way to humble houses, local shops and street markets. Ryan watched everything from the window as if he were visiting another planet. He had spent his entire life circulating only between the Upper East Side, the financial district, and a few tourist spots. He had never really seen how most New Yorkers lived. He felt a pang of shame as he realized how oblivious he had been to the reality of the city where he was born. The shelter was a simple 2-story building, painted a pale yellow with a small yard out front where a few children were playing under the supervision of volunteers. A sign at the entrance read, "The Fresh Start Welcome House," and underneath, in smaller letters, something about offering temporary support to families in vulnerable situations. Ryan got out of the car with his heart pounding, asking Joe to wait there. He walked to the gate, his hands sweating despite the chill, not knowing exactly what he was going to say when he saw Sarah again. That's when he heard the laughter. He turned toward the sound and saw 3 identical girls, chasing a ball in the yard. It was them, his daughters. In the daylight, without the rain and the fear of their first encounter, Ryan could see them better. They had light brown, slightly curly hair, cut simply but neatly. They wore similar but not identical clothes, as if someone had made sure each one kept a bit of her own individuality. One had a pink t-shirt with a butterfly on it, another a light blue top, and the third wore yellow with stars. But their faces were absolutely identical and absolutely familiar. It was like looking at old photographs. Fav himself as a child, only multiplied by 3 and with a touch of Sarah's delicacy. The ball rolled toward Ryan. One of the girls, the one in the yellow top, ran to get it and almost bumped into him. She stopped, startled, looking up at him with those almond-shaped eyes that were copies of his own. Ryan crouched down slowly, picked up the ball, and held it out to her carefully, as if approaching a small bird that might fly away at any moment. The girl took the ball and, to his surprise, smiled. A small, shy but genuine, smile. She said thank you in a tiny voice and ran back to her sisters. Ryan stood there, feeling his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. That little girl had thanked him. She had smiled at him. She didn't know who he was, didn't know they shared the same blood, but she had been kind to him in a spontaneous, natural way. He felt his eyes burn and blinked quickly to hold back the tears. He couldn't fall apart here, not in front of them, not before talking to Sarah. That's when he saw her. Sarah was standing in the doorway of the shelter, holding a laundry basket, completely still. her face as pale as if she'd seen a ghost. Her gaze shifted from the daughter who had just spoken to Ryan back to him, and Ryan saw the exact moment panic took over her again. She dropped the basket and started walking quickly toward the girls, with the clear intention of grabbing them and going back inside. Ryan acted on instinct. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace and took a few steps toward her, speaking softly but firmly. "Sarah, please don't run again. I just want to talk. Just talk, I promise." She stopped, but it was clear how tense she was, ready to bolt at the slightest sign of a threat. The children, sensing their mother's tension, stopped playing and gathered around her, each one grabbing a piece of Sarah's clothing. The one in the pink shirt asked if everything was okay, and Sarah answered yes in a trembling voice. Ryan felt a stab in his chest, seeing the fear in her eyes. Fear of him. How had it come to this? How could the woman who once loved him now look at him as if he were a threat? An older woman, likely the shelter's director, appeared in the doorway, assessing the situation with an experienced eye. She asked if Sarah knew this man, if she needed help. Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly, saying she knew him, but that everything was fine. The director, a black woman with graying hair and a steady gaze, didn't seem entirely convinced, but respected Sarah's word. She told the girls they could keep playing, but stayed nearby, clearly keeping watch. Ryan and Sarah stood there a few feet apart, with 6 years of silence between them. It was Sarah who spoke first, her voice low, laden with a mix of pain and what seemed like restrained anger. "What do you want, Ryan? Why did you come here?" The words were harsh, but Ryan heard the tremor in them. He took another careful step toward her, keeping his hands where she could see them, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "I want to understand, Sarah. I want to understand what happened. Why you left. Why you never told me about them. About our daughters." Sarah closed her eyes as if the words had physically struck her. When she opened them again, they were shining with tears she refused to let fall. "Our daughters? You have no right to call them that. You weren't there when I found out I was pregnant, alone, scared, not knowing what to do. You weren't there when they were born, 3 at once, and I thought I was going to die from the fear and the pain. You weren't there on the nights they cried from hunger, and I had no way to feed them properly. You have no right to show up now and claim something you never wanted to. Know about?" Her voice had risen, full of years of accumulated grief. Ryan felt each word like a punch, but at the same time something didn't make sense. Never wanted to know. What was she talking about? "Sarah, I didn't know. You left me. You left without explaining anything, without giving us a chance to talk. How could I have known about a pregnancy if you disappeared from my life?" Sarah let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "I left because I had no choice, Ryan. Because your father made it very clear that my presence in your life was a problem, that I was getting in the way of his plans, risking the family's reputation, compromising important deals. I left because I was told it was the best thing for you, that I would only drag you down." Ryan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "My father? What does my father have to do with this?" Sarah looked at him as if he were incredibly naive. "Everything, Ryan. Your father has everything to do with this. He was the one who approached me, who showed me documents, who convinced me that my presence in your life would destroy everything. You had built, and like an idiot I believed him. I thought I was protecting you." The shelter director, sensing the conversation was getting more intense, came closer and suggested they go inside to talk privately. Sarah hesitated, but eventually agreed, asking a volunteer to keep an eye on the girls. Ryan followed the 2 women into the building, his mind spinning frantically, trying to process what Sarah had just revealed. Arthur had been involved in her disappearance. His own father had manipulated the situation, had driven Sarah away from him. They sat in a small room that served as the director's office, a simple space with a wooden desk, a few chairs, and shelves full of folders and documents. The director, who introduced herself as Ms. Evelyn, offered them water and remained present during the conversation, making it clear she was there to protect Sarah if needed. Ryan accepted the water with a nod and turned to Sarah, who was sitting as far away from him as possible, her arms crossed defensively. "Sarah, please, tell me everything. From the beginning. What did my father do? What did he say to you?" Sarah was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall, as if gathering the strength to relive painful memories. When she began to speak, her voice was more controlled, but each word carried the weight of years of suffering. She explained that 3 months before she disappeared, she had started getting strange calls from a law firm. They said they needed to speak with her about urgent matters related to Ryan and the Anderson family. At first, she ignored them, thinking it was some kind of scam. But the calls persisted until one day Arthur Anderson himself showed up at the school, where she worked. He was kind, polite, even fatherly. He invited her for coffee, said he wanted to get to know her better, that she was going to marry his son after all. During that coffee, Arthur started by talking about the corporate group, about the responsibilities that came with the Anderson name, about the future he had planned for Ryan. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. He began asking questions about her family, her education, her ambitions, not in a hostile way, but in a manner that made it clear she was being evaluated and judged, and failing the test. In the following weeks, Arthur kept appearing in her life, always polite, always subtle, but always leaving clear messages. He talked about women who had married powerful men and ended up destroying their careers, about relationships that seemed based on love but were really just about financial gain, about how the press and competitors loved to find weak spots in important families. Sarah began to feel like she was being painted as a danger, a threat, even though she was doing nothing but loving Ryan. Then came the final blow. Arthur showed up with documents, official-looking papers she barely understood, something about a financial transaction, suspicious movements, investigations. He said the corporate group was being audited, that there were suspicions of irregularities, and that her name had been mentioned in reports. Sarah was terrified. She didn't understand how her name could be involved in anything related to the family's business. Arthur explained in that calm, measured voice that sometimes people close to public figures were used as fronts, as straw men, without even knowing it. That all it took was one signature on a seemingly harmless document for someone to become an accomplice to something bigger. If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you have believed Ryan's father, or would you have been suspicious from the start? Let us know in the comments. Sarah clearly remembered the moment Arthur placed an envelope in front of her. Inside was a copy of a document she had signed months earlier when Ryan had asked her to help with some company paperwork. At the time, he had said it was just a formality, something about transferring some shares between family members, and that he needed a witness for the signature. She had signed without question because she trusted him. Now Arthur was showing her that same document as proof that she was involved in a dubious financial operation, that if the audit uncovered it, she could be indicted, that Ryan, by association, could also be dragged into the scandal, that everything he had built could come crashing down. The patriarch made it clear that he had ways to protect Ryan, that he had lawyers, contacts, influence, but protecting Sarah as well would be much more complicated unless she stepped back, unless she got out of the picture before everything blew up. He said that sometimes true love required sacrifice, required making difficult choices, for the good of the person you loved. He offered financial help for her to start over somewhere else, far away, where no one would find her. Sarah refused to take any money, but she accepted the perverse logic Arthur had planted in her mind. She believed her presence was putting Ryan in danger. She believed that leaving was protecting him. She wrote the note that morning with a broken heart, each word costing a piece of her soul. She couldn't tell him the truth, because Arthur had made it clear that if she did, the documents would be used, against Ryan anyway. So she wrote something vague about not being good enough, about him deserving better, and disappeared. She took a bus to upstate New York to Albany, where she had a distant cousin. It was there, alone and devastated, that she discovered she was pregnant, with triplets. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Her small frame wasn't prepared to carry 3 babies. She spent months on bed rest, depending on the kindness of a cousin she barely knew, feeling useless and scared. She wanted to call Ryan 1,000 times, wanted to tell him, wanted to ask for help. But every time she picked up the phone, she remembered Arthur's words, the documents, the danger her presence represented. She thought she was doing the right thing, that she was being strong, that she was protecting the man she loved. The girls were born premature, small and fragile, requiring intensive care that Sarah could barely afford. Her cousin helped as much as she could, but she had her own family, her own problems. After a few months, Sarah realized she couldn't keep being a burden. She returned to New York City with the 3 babies, tried to find work, but no one would hire a single mother with infant triplets. She tried shelters, social programs, anything that could help keep her daughters fed and safe. It was years of struggle, of sleepless nights, of choosing between eating herself or buying formula for the girls. Years of watching her daughters grow up without a father, without stability, without the life they deserved. And all that time, Sarah never knew if Ryan had recovered from the scandal Arthur said was coming. She didn't look him up online, didn't search for news, because she was afraid of what she would find. She was afraid of discovering it had all been for nothing, that he had been destroyed anyway. Or worse, she was afraid of discovering that he had moved on easily, that he had forgotten her, that he had found someone more suitable, just as his father had always wanted. So she lived those 6 years in a kind of limbo, with no past, no future, just surviving one day at a time for the sake of the 3 girls who were the only thing that made it all worthwhile. When she finished speaking, tears were streaming down Sarah's face, but her voice remained steady. Ryan was devastated, his hands shaking, his breathing ragged. It all made sense now. The sudden disappearance, the vague note, her refusal to accept his attempts to contact her in the first few months. Sarah hadn't abandoned him. Sarah had been manipulated. She had been used. And by whom? By his own father. The man who should have protected his happiness had been the architect of its destruction. Miss Evelyn, who had listened to everything in silence, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder in a gesture of support. She looked at Ryan with an expression that mixed compassion and firmness. "Sir, I know this is all very painful for you too, but you need to understand that Sarah has been through a tremendous trauma. She did what she thought was right based on the information she had. Now, if you really want to be in these children's lives, you're going to have to prove you're different from your father. You're going to have to earn her trust back, and that's not going to happen overnight." Ryan nodded, wiping his face with his hands. He looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her look away. "I'm going to find out the whole truth, Sarah. I'm going to find out exactly what my father did, what those documents were, what was really happening 6 years ago. And I'm going to prove to you that none of it was real, that you were never a danger to me, that we were manipulated, both of us." Sarah shook her head, weary. "And is that going to change anything, Ryan? Is it going to erase these 6 years? Is it going to give back the time your daughters spent without a father? Is it going to make up for all the nights I spent thinking I was doing the right thing while I was dying inside?" "No, it won't," Ryan answered with brutal honesty. "It won't change the past, but it can change the future. It can mean they grow up knowing their father. It can mean you never have to struggle again. It can bring justice." Sarah was silent, clearly torn between her accumulated anger and the exhaustion of carrying everything alone for so long. Ryan respected her silence, waiting. Finally, Miss Evelyn suggested they stop for now, that Sarah needed time to process everything. But before Ryan left, the director made a proposal. If he really wanted to prove he was serious about being present, he should start small. He should show up at the shelter, help with chores, let the girls get used to him naturally, without pressure, without forcing it. He should earn Sarah's trust through actions, not words. Ryan agreed immediately. He asked if he could come back the next day. Miss Evelyn looked at Sarah, who, after a moment's hesitation, gave a small nod of agreement. As Ryan left, he glanced back one last time and saw Sarah watching the triplets play in the yard, her shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat, mixed with relief. It was as if she had been carrying a secret too heavy for too long and had finally been able to set it down, even if it meant facing the consequences. On the way back, Ryan asked Joe to take him straight to the family mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, where his father lived. He had questions that needed answers, and he wasn't going to wait another day to start digging up the truth. The Anderson family mansion was in Greenwich, Connecticut. an affluent town where homes were protected by high walls and security cameras. Ryan passed through the electronic gate without needing to be announced. The system automatically recognized the car's license plate. It was almost 9 at night when he climbed the marble steps to the entrance, his anger growing with each step. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't want to give his father a chance to prepare defenses or excuses. He found Arthur Anderson in the library, a massive room with mahogany shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books the patriarch collected but rarely read. The old man was sitting in his leather armchair, a glass of brandy in his hand, reading financial reports even at that hour. He looked up as Ryan entered, and something in his son's expression made him slowly place the papers on the side table. "Ryan, what a surprise. I thought you were still at the office dealing with that issue with the European investors." Ryan closed the library door behind him with more force than necessary. He walked until he was standing before his father, refusing to sit, refusing to turn this into a civilized conversation. Arthur sensed the tension, and his posture became more defensive, though he maintained the neutral expression he always used in difficult negotiations. "I found Sarah today," Ryan said without preamble, "and our 3 daughters." "Yes, Dad, I have 3 daughters. 6-year-old triplets I never knew because Sarah disappeared from my life without an explanation, or rather with an explanation that you fabricated." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Arthur took a sip of his brandy, his eyes calculating, measuring how much his son knew, how much he could deny, how much he needed to admit. Finally, he set the glass aside and sighed, like someone about to explain the obvious to a stubborn child. "Ryan, you need to understand the context of the time. That girl was not suitable for you. She didn't have the education, the connections, the understanding of how our world works. We were preparing for an extremely delicate merger with a European group, and the family's image was crucial. I couldn't allow an inappropriate relationship to put everything at risk." "Inappropriate relationship," Ryan shouted, his voice echoing through the library. "She was the woman I loved. We were going to get married, and you drove her away from me with lies and manipulation." Arthur stood up, putting himself on the same level as his son, his executive posture kicking in. "They weren't lies. They were necessary measures to protect you and this family. Yes, I approached her. Yes, I explained the situation in a way she would understand its gravity. And it worked. She left, you focused on the business, and the merger was a success. We moved $500 million in that deal, Ryan. $500 million. Do you think that would have happened if you were involved with a public school teacher who didn't know the difference between a balance sheet and a cost spreadsheet?" Ryan felt the rage boil in his veins. How could his father be so cold, so calculating, reducing love to numbers and corporate mergers? "And the documents you showed her? The story about investigations and irregularities? Was that true or just another lie to scare her?" Arthur hesitated for the first time, and Ryan knew immediately he had hit a nerve. The patriarch turned, walking to the window that overlooked the illuminated garden, his hands clasped behind his back. "There were some financial movements that required legal protection. Nothing you need to worry about. All necessary precautions were taken." "You used her name," Ryan accused, the realization hitting him like a punch. "You forged her signature on documents, didn't you? You used her as a front for one of your shady deals, and then you threatened her, telling her she was in danger." Arthur turned abruptly, his face finally showing irritation. "I protected this family. I did what was necessary to ensure the empire I built didn't crumble because of your sentimental choices. That girl signed some papers willingly when you asked her to, and yes, I used that as part of a perfectly acceptable legal structure. If she was frightened by the consequences, it was because she lacked the maturity to understand the world you live in." Ryan felt sick. It was all clear now. His father had truly used Sarah, had forged documents, had created a legal trap, and then convinced her she was a danger to Ryan. And the worst part was that Arthur showed no remorse. To him, it had just been a successful business move. "I have 3 daughters, Dad. 3 little girls who spent 6 years without a father because you decided you knew what was best for me. Sarah spent 6 years in poverty, raising those children alone, thinking she was protecting me. And you never told me anything. You never gave a damn about the consequences of what you did." Arthur shrugged, a gesture that made Ryan want to punch something. If she got pregnant and didn't come to me, that was her choice. I gave her the chance to start over far from here, with financial support, I might add, which she refused out of foolish pride. What happened after that is not my responsibility. Ryan took 2 steps toward his father, his fists clenched. Not your responsibility. You destroyed my life, you destroyed her life, you condemned 3 innocent children to grow up without a father. And you think you can just shrug and say it's not your problem? Arthur straightened his shoulders, adopting the authoritative posture he always used to end arguments. What's done is done. Now you need to think rationally about what to do next. If these children are really yours, you can get a paternity test and establish child support. But bringing that woman back into your life, especially now that she's in a precarious situation, will look opportunistic. The press will love it. Millionaire heir abandons poor fiancé and triplets, returns 6 years later. Have you thought about that? Ryan looked at his father as if he were seeing a stranger. How had it taken him so long to realize who Arthur Anderson really was? A man for whom everything came down to image, profit, and control. A man incapable of understanding that some things in life were worth more than financial empires. You know what I think, Dad? I think I've spent my whole life trying to be the son you wanted. The perfect executive, the ideal heir, the man without weaknesses. And I became exactly that. A copy of you. Cold, calculating, empty. Sarah was the only person who made me feel like I could be different. And you ripped that away from me. You ripped away the only piece of humanity I had. Don't be dramatic, Arthur retorted with disdain. You've had countless opportunities to find someone suitable. If you chose to focus on the business, that was your decision. It wasn't my decision. You decided for me when you drove Sarah away. And you decided for my daughters when you condemned them to grow up without a father. But now I'm going to make my own decisions. Ryan turned to leave but stopped at the door, looking back one last time. I'm going to find out exactly what you did 6 years ago. I'm going to find the documents, the transactions, everything. And if I find out you committed crimes using Sarah's name, I'm going to report you. I don't care if it destroys the company or the Anderson name. I don't care anymore. He left the mansion feeling simultaneously drained and energized. For the first time in 6 years, he had a purpose that went beyond spreadsheets and meetings. He was going to find the whole truth and get justice. But first he was going to get to know his daughters. In the following days, Ryan established a routine that surprised everyone who knew him. He woke up early, went to the office only as much as was necessary to keep basic operations running, delegating as much as possible to other directors. Then he would get in his car and drive to the shelter in the Bronx. He always brought something useful, not extravagant gifts that would draw attention, but practical things. School supplies for the shelter's children, groceries, replacement parts for broken items. Miss Evelyn watched it all with her experienced eye, seeing that this wealthy man was genuinely trying to understand a world very different from his own. Ryan spent hours at the shelter, helping fix a leaky faucet, painting a peeling wall, organizing donations. He didn't try to approach the triplets immediately, but they, with the natural curiosity of children, began to orbit around him. The first to completely break the barrier was the girl in the yellow top, the same one who had thanked him for the ball on the first day. One afternoon, Ryan was crouched in the yard trying to fix a rusty seesaw when he felt a tug on his shirt. He turned and saw those almond-shaped eyes looking at him with pure interest. "What are you doing?" she asked with the frankness typical of a child. "I'm trying to get this seesaw working again," Ryan answered carefully, his heart speeding up. "But it's pretty rusty. I think it's going to need some oil." "I can help you," the girl offered. "I'm good at fixing things. Miss Evelyn always says so." Ryan smiled, a genuine smile he couldn't remember, having in a long time. "Then I'm definitely going to need your help. What's your name?" "Leah, and those are my sisters, Sophia and Beatrice. We're triplets." "Did you know triplets is when 3 babies are born together?" "Yes, I did," Ryan replied, his voice cracking a little. "Those are very beautiful names." "Our mom picked them. She says each name has a special meaning. Leah is for devotion, Sophia is for wisdom, and Beatrice is for the one who brings happiness. Ryan had to blink several times to hold back tears. Sarah had chosen those names with such care, such love. He spent the entire afternoon fixing the seesaw with Leah by his side, asking endless questions, telling stories about her and her sisters, about the things they liked to do, about the pictures they drew. It was as if a floodgate had opened in Ryan's heart, letting in a torrent of feelings he had suppressed for so long. Sarah watched from a distance, leaning against the shelter's doorframe, her arms crossed, but her expression less harsh than in the first few days. She saw Ryan, the man who had always been so elegant and distant, now with grease-stained hands and a wrinkled shirt, laughing at a 6-year-old's jokes. It was an image she had never imagined possible, but one that somehow felt right. That night, after the girls were asleep in the communal room they shared with other children at the shelter, Sarah went out to the small front yard. She found Ryan sitting on the curb, looking up at the dark New York sky where few stars could pierce the light pollution. She hesitated, then sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance. "Leah likes you," Sarah said softly. "She's the most outgoing of the three. Sophia is more of an observer. She just watches before deciding if she can trust someone. And Beatrice is the protector, always looking out for her sisters." Ryan turned to her, his eyes shining in the dim light. "They're incredible, Sarah. They're smart, kind, curious. You did an amazing job raising them on your own." Sarah let out a humorless laugh. "I don't know if amazing is the word. There were days I couldn't give them more than rice and beans to eat. There were nights we had nowhere to sleep. There were times I thought about giving up, about finding an institution that could take better care of them than I could. But you didn't give up," Ryan pointed out firmly. "You fought. You kept them together, safe, loved. That's more than amazing. It's heroic." Sarah was silent, processing the compliment. She wasn't used to being seen as a hero. She was used to seeing herself as a failure, as the woman who couldn't give her daughters the life they deserved. "I'm investigating what my father did 6 years ago," Ryan continued. "I've gained access to the company's old files. I found some inconsistencies in the financial reports from that time, strange transactions that don't follow the normal pattern of operations. I'm gathering evidence. When I have enough, I'm going to see an independent lawyer, someone with no ties to the family." Sarah looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "And when you find out the whole truth, what will you do? Will you report your own father?" "If I have to, yes. What he did wasn't just emotional manipulation, Sarah. It was a crime, forgery, identity theft, probably tax fraud. He needs to be held accountable for it. And you're willing to destroy your family's empire for that?" "It's not my empire," Ryan answered with conviction. "It never was. It was built on lies, on manipulation, on people being used as chess pieces. I'd rather have the truth and 3 daughters who truly know me than a rotten empire." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the armor she had built around her heart over the past 6 years. She wasn't ready to forgive completely, wasn't ready to trust. But for the first time, she began to consider that maybe Ryan wasn't just an extension of his father, that maybe he was capable of making different choices. In the days that followed, Ryan intensified his investigation into the company's archives. He discovered that around the time of Sarah's disappearance, the Anderson Group was involved in acquiring a smaller company, and that some funds had been moved through accounts that were not part of the group's normal structure. One of these accounts had the name Sarah Miller as a secondary signatory based on documents she had signed months earlier when Ryan had naively asked her to witness some internal transfers. The lawyer Ryan consulted, a professional known for his integrity and independence, analyzed the documents and confirmed there were clear signs of fraud and identity theft. Sarah's signature on some critical documents had inconsistencies with the signatures she had actually given voluntarily. Someone had replicated her signature, likely Arthur himself or someone acting on his orders, to create a legal structure that would allow for questionable financial movements without directly exposing the Anderson name. When Ryan confronted his father again with this evidence, Arthur finally lost his composure. He admitted with anger and not remorse that he had done what was necessary to protect the company from a more rigorous audit, that he had used his son's relationship with Sarah as an opportunity to create a legal buffer. That later, when he realized Ryan wasn't going to forget the girl so easily, he decided the most practical thing was to make her disappear from his life. And he justified everything, absolutely everything, in the name of business success, family protection, and the preservation of the Anderson legacy. Ryan left that conversation feeling physically ill. He had grown up admiring his father, wanting to be like him, to build an empire as he had. Now he saw that the empire had rotten foundations, that every success had cost someone's integrity, that the Anderson name was stained in a way that couldn't be washed away with money or power. He then made the most difficult decision of his life. He took all the documents he had gathered to the lawyer and authorized a formal complaint to be filed with the authorities. He knew this would trigger an investigation that could destroy the Anderson Group. He knew his father could face criminal charges. He knew his own life of luxury and privilege would end. But he also knew it was the only way to get justice. For Sarah to clear her name, to show his daughters that some things were more important than money and power. When he told Sarah what he had done, he expected her to be relieved, maybe even grateful. But her reaction surprised him. Sarah began to cry, not tears of joy, but of fear and accumulated pain. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I spent 6 years carrying the guilt of thinking I had hurt you, 6 years punishing myself for believing your father's lies. And now I find out there really were documents with my forged signature that I was used in actual crimes. How am I going to look at my daughters and explain this?" Ryan held her by the shoulders, forcing her to look into his eyes. "You're going to look at them and tell them the truth, that you were a victim, not a criminal, that you were manipulated by a powerful man who cared about nothing but his own interests, that you fought with all your strength to protect them even when the whole world was against you. You're going to tell them you're a survivor, Sarah, and that they have the blood of a survivor running through their veins." Sarah collapsed into his embrace, for the first time in 6 years allowing herself to be vulnerable, allowing herself to accept comfort from someone. Ryan held her, feeling the weight of everything they had lost, everything they had suffered, but also the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new on the ruins of the past. The scandal broke 3 weeks later, when the press received information about the ongoing investigations involving the Anderson Group. The headlines were devastating. "Financial empire under investigation for fraud. Forgery scandal involves innocent woman's name." Air reports. His own father. Ryan woke up every day to dozens of missed calls from journalists, concerned partners, and high society members who suddenly pretended not to know the family. The company's stock plummeted. Meetings were cancelled. Contracts were suspended. Arthur Anderson, always so composed and controlled, began to show signs of deterioration. The pressure of the investigations, the real possibility of criminal charges, the destruction of the reputation he had spent a lifetime building, it all began to take its toll. Ryan still visited him occasionally, not out of affection, but out of a strange sense of responsibility. After all, as much as he hated what his father had done, he was still his father. It was during one of these visits, 2 weeks after the formal investigations began, that Ryan found Arthur collapsed in the library, clutching his chest, his face pale and sweaty. He called an ambulance immediately. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed a massive heart attack. Arthur Anderson, the man who had always seemed indestructible, was lying in a hospital bed, connected to machines, fragile and vulnerable for the first time in his life. Ryan stood in the hospital corridor for hours, not inside the room, but close enough, in case he was needed. Sarah showed up to his surprise, brought by Joe, who had picked her up from the shelter. She didn't say she came out of compassion, but Ryan understood the gesture for what it was. A demonstration that, despite everything, she was not cruel, that she could separate the man who had destroyed her from the father of the man she had loved. When the doctors finally allowed visitors, Ryan went in alone. Arthur was awake, but clearly weakened. He turned his head slowly as his son approached, and for the first time Ryan saw something. In his father's eyes he had never seen before. Fear. Not fear of dying, but fear of having lost everything he considered important. The empire, the reputation, and now, seeing his son there with that distant expression, perhaps even his own son. "Am I going to die?" Arthur asked in a weak voice. I don't know, Ryan answered honestly. The doctors say the next 24 hours are critical. Arthur closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, there was a vulnerability there that Ryan had never witnessed. I did it all wrong, didn't I? I thought I was protecting you, preparing you for the real world, but I was just repeating the same mistakes my father made with me. Ryan pulled up a chair and sat by the bed. He didn't take his father's hand, didn't offer physical comfort, but he stayed there, present. Yes, you did it all wrong. You turned love into a weakness, family into property, people into game pieces, and you taught me to do the same. It took me 6 years to realize how lost I had become trying to be you. Arthur let out something between a laugh and a painful sigh. Your grandfather used to say that men in our position couldn't afford to feel, that the business world devoured those who showed heart. I believed that my whole life, and look where it got me, alone in a hospital bed with a son who can barely look at me. Ryan felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but he didn't let it soften his resolve. I have 3 daughters who have never met their grandfather, a woman who suffered for 6 years because of your lies. You may have believed you were doing the right thing, but the consequences are real. Real people were destroyed by your choices. Arthur was silent, the beeping of the machines filling the space between them. Finally, with visible effort, he spoke. Those girls, the triplets, are they really my granddaughters? They are, Ryan confirmed, and they're wonderful. Smart, kind, full of life despite everything they've been through. Everything you could have known if you hadn't been so obsessed with control and appearances. Arthur turned his face away, and Ryan wasn't sure if he saw tears or if it was just the reflection of the hospital lights. When the patriarch spoke again, his voice was heavy with an emotion Ryan couldn't quite identify. There's a box in the safe in my home office. The combination is your mother's birthday. Inside are documents, letters, things I've kept over the years. Maybe it will explain some things. It might not justify them, but it might explain. Ryan nodded, storing the information. He stayed for a few more minutes, then stood to leave. At the door, he hesitated. He turned to look at his father one more time. I hope you recover, not because I forgive what you did, but because everyone deserves a chance to try to fix their mistakes, even if it's too late to undo the damage. He left the hospital with mixed feelings. He didn't feel the satisfaction he had imagined he would feel seeing his father brought low, just a tired emptiness, an exhaustion from carrying so much resentment, so much anger. Sarah was waiting for him in the lobby, and without a word, they walked out to the parking lot together. In the car, she took his hand, a small but significant gesture. In the days that followed, while Arthur slowly recovered in the hospital, Ryan opened the box his father had mentioned. Inside, he found a disturbing mix of documents, letters from Ryan's mother, who had died when he was just 10, talking about her dreams for her son, about the importance of love and kindness over financial success. Letters Arthur had apparently never answered, but had kept. There were also documents about Arthur's own childhood, about a tyrannical father who had raised him with severe punishments, about a family where affection was seen as weakness. Ryan then understood that his father had been to some extent a victim too, a victim of a cycle of coldness and control that had been passed down through generations of the Anderson family. It didn't justify what Arthur had done, but it explained it. And understanding, Ryan realized, was the first step to breaking that cycle. He would not repeat his father's mistakes with his own daughters. He would be different. With the investigations underway and the corporate group in turmoil, Ryan made decisions that shocked the corporate world. He formally renounced his position as heir. He refused any future inheritance from Arthur's estate, directing everything that could be directed toward employee severance, debt settlement, and reparations. He announced he would legally change his last name, adopting his mother's maiden name, Miller, a common name free from the weight and contamination of the Anderson name. New York high society treated him like a pariah. Longtime friends turned their backs. Exclusive clubs cancelled his membership. But Ryan discovered he didn't miss any of it. He felt lighter than he had in years, as if he had taken off a heavy suit of armor he had worn for so long he had forgotten what it was like to breathe without it. with his personal savings and some private investments not tied to the family group. Ryan started a completely different project. He created a non-profit foundation dedicated to supporting women and children in vulnerable situations, especially those who had been victims of manipulation, psychological abuse, or abandonment. He named it the Fresh Start Foundation, a tribute to the shelter that had taken in Sarah and his daughters when they had nowhere else to go. He invited Ms. Evelyn to be the foundation's social director. The director, despite her age and decades of working in simple shelters, accepted the challenge with enthusiasm. Together they planned a space that would offer not just temporary shelter, but vocational training, psychological support, legal aid and daycare for children while their mothers studied or worked. A place that wouldn't just help people survive, but rebuild their lives with dignity. When Ryan proposed that Sarah lead art workshops at the foundation, she initially refused. She said she wasn't qualified enough, that she was just a public school teacher who hadn't even managed to keep her job. Ryan reminded her that she had raised 3 incredible children on her own, that she had survived years of hardship without losing her humanity, that she had more strength and resilience than any degree could certify. Gradually, Sarah accepted. She started with small workshops, teaching children from the shelter to draw, to paint, to express their emotions through art. And she discovered she had a natural talent for helping traumatized children open up through creativity. The triplets, now 6½, slowly began to understand that this man who showed up every day, who played with them, who listened to their stories, who painted with them, was their father. There was no dramatic moment of revelation. It was a gradual, natural process. Leah, always the most direct, was the first to ask. "You're our dad, right?" she asked one afternoon, as Ryan helped her build a castle out of blocks. Ryan looked at Sarah, who was nearby, watching. She nodded slightly, giving him permission. Ryan knelt down to Leah's level, looking directly into those almond-shaped eyes that were so much like his own. "Yes, I'm your dad. And Sophia's and Beatrice's too. I'm so sorry I wasn't here before, but I promise that from now on, I'll always be here whenever you need me." Leah processed the information with the seriousness of a 6-year-old, then nodded as if accepting the terms of a contract. "Okay, but you have to learn how to do braids because Mommy doesn't know how to do them right, and our braids are always crooked." Ryan laughed, tears streaming down his face, and promised he would learn. That night, he watched YouTube tutorials on how to braid children's hair. The next day, he practiced on all 3 girls until he could make decent, if not perfect, braids. They laughed at his first clumsy attempts, but let him keep trying, and that simple act of care, of being present, of trying to learn something new just because it mattered to them, meant more than any expensive gift ever could. Sophia, the observer, took longer to come around completely. She would watch Ryan from a distance, analyzing, gauging if she could trust him. It was only after weeks, when Ryan spent the entire night at the hospital with her after she caught a bad virus, holding her little hand while she slept fitfully, that Sophia finally accepted him completely. When she woke up in the morning and saw him there, with dark circles under his eyes but still holding her hand, Sophia smiled and called him Dad for the first time. Beatrice, the protector, took even longer. She was the guardian of her sisters, the one who always stood between them and any potential danger. She watched Ryan with the natural suspicion of someone who had learned early on that the world could be cruel. It was through her mother that she finally relented. One night, when Sarah finally admitted to Ryan that she was starting to trust him again, that she was starting to believe he had really changed, Beatrice overheard the conversation, and if her mom trusted him, then she could too. 3 months after his heart attack, Arthur was released from the hospital. He was more fragile, quieter, aged in a way that wasn't just about his physical health. The investigations were still ongoing, but his lawyers had managed to secure a deal where Arthur would take responsibility, pay heavy fines, and permanently step away from the corporate world, avoiding a full criminal trial in exchange for total cooperation with the authorities. The Anderson Group was dismantled, sold off in pieces, its assets distributed to pay debts and compensations. Ryan took the triplets to meet their grandfather once. It was a brief meeting at the assisted living facility where Arthur now lived, a comfortable but unluxurious place suited to his new, reduced financial reality. The old man looked at the three identical girls with an expression that was hard to decipher. He said they were beautiful, that they looked like the grandmother they never knew. Leah, always unfiltered, asked why he hadn't come to meet them sooner. Arthur didn't know what to say. Ryan didn't force a relationship between the girls and their grandfather. He left the door open for occasional visits but never pushed. The triplets had a right to know where they came from, but they also had a right not to carry the mistakes of past generations. The opening of the Fresh Start Foundation took place on a sunny Saturday in October. The renovated building, in an accessible part of the Bronx, was decorated with drawings made by the children it served. There was no luxury, no ostentation, just a welcoming, clean space filled with light and hope. Mothers with their children, volunteers, a few journalists still interested in covering stories of reconstruction and not just scandal, and former Anderson Group employees Ryan had managed to re-employ all attended. Sarah gave a simple but moving speech about turning pain into a seed for change, about how every person present represented not a failure, but a story of resilience. Ryan stood beside her, no longer the center of attention, no longer the powerful executive giving orders, but a man who had chosen to step down from the pedestal to walk on the same level as others. The moment that stuck in everyone's memory happened after the speeches ended. The triplets, who had been sitting in the front row with a volunteer, ran up to the makeshift stage. They hugged Ryan and Sarah together, and Leah said loudly for everyone to hear that this was the happiest day of their lives because they finally had a complete family and a place that helped other families become complete too. The audience was moved, not because it was a scene manufactured for impact, but because it was genuine. It was three children who had spent years without stability finally finding a safe place in the world. In the following months, the Fresh Start Foundation began to make a real difference in the community. Women who had left abusive relationships found a space to rebuild their lives. Children who had only known the streets discovered they could have an education, proper nutrition, and a place to play. Sarah found purpose in helping other mothers, in showing them it was possible to survive and even thrive after immense hardship. Ryan discovered that success wasn't measured in zeros in a bank account, but in transformed lives, in children's smiles, in women regaining their self-esteem. The relationship between Ryan and Sarah evolved slowly, without rush, without pressure. It wasn't an immediate return to the romance they had shared 6 years earlier. They were different people now, shaped by suffering, loss, and struggle. But gradually they rediscovered each other. They started having dinner together after the girls were asleep, talking about their day, the challenges at the foundation, the small victories and defeats. They discovered they still laughed at the same things, that they still understood each other with just a look, that the connection they had shared hadn't died but had just been dormant, waiting for the right time to bloom again. A year after their reunion on that rainy sidewalk, Ryan and Sarah were walking in Van Cortlandt Park with the triplets. It was a typical Sunday afternoon, with families having picnics, children flying kites, and vendors selling ice cream and cotton candy. The girls ran ahead, Leah shouting for her mom and dad to watch how fast she could run, Sophia stopping to watch birds, Beatrice constantly running back to make sure her parents were keeping up. Sarah's hand was intertwined with Ryan's, a gesture that had become natural after months of slowly rebuilding trust. She looked at him and saw no longer the cold, distant executive she had known years ago, nor the broken, desperate man who had found her under the tarp in the rain. She saw someone who had chosen to change, who had had the courage to dismantle his own life and rebuild it from scratch, based on true values. Ryan, feeling her gaze, turned and smiled. A light, genuine smile, free from the weight he had carried for so long. The triplets called them over to play hide-and-seek, and they ran to join them, not caring about the curious looks from other park-goers. They ran, they laughed, they played like an ordinary family, like any family that had found its way back to each other after almost being completely lost. As the sun began to set, painting the New York sky with shades of orange and pink, they walked together back to the simple apartment Ryan had rented near the shelter, a world away from the luxury penthouses of his former life. The girls were tired, Beatrice practically asleep on her father's shoulder, Sophia and Leah each holding one of their mother's hands. It was a common, ordinary scene, the kind that happened in thousands of families every day. But for them, who had lost 6 years, who had endured manipulation, abandonment, poverty, and nearly lost everything, that common scene was extraordinary. Sarah looked at Ryan carrying Beatrice, his expensive suit replaced by jeans and a simple t-shirt, his Italian shoes swapped for comfortable sneakers, and felt a wave of love she had tried to suppress for so long. It wasn't the same naive love from 6 years ago. It was something deeper, tested by fire, forged in suffering, but all the stronger for it. It was the love of two people who had seen the worst in each other, in the world, in themselves, and still chose to be together. That night, after the girls were asleep, Ryan and Sarah sat on the small living room sofa with a simple cup of tea and talked about the future. They talked about expanding the foundation to other areas, about maybe one day making their relationship official, not on paper but by conscious choice, about teaching the girls that family wasn't defined by money or status, but by love, presence, and commitment. They talked about breaking the cycles of pain they had both carried and building something new, something better for the next generation. Ryan thought of his father, still alive but distant, trying to deal with the legacy he had left. He thought of the years he had wasted being someone he didn't want to be. He thought of all the wrong choices that had led him to this point, but he also thought of the 3 girls sleeping in the next room, of the woman beside him who had survived everything and emerged stronger, of the foundation that was changing lives every day. He thought that maybe all that pain, all that suffering had a purpose, not because suffering was necessary or just, but because they had chosen to transform it into something meaningful. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, and Ryan wrapped his arm around her, feeling the weight of the years past, but also the lightness of the present and the hope for the future. They hadn't gone back to who they were before. They were new people, rebuilt from the ashes of who they had been, and these new versions of themselves, shaped by pain but not defined by it, had a real chance to build something that would last. Outside, the city of New York continued its frantic pace, millions of stories unfolding simultaneously, each person carrying their own pains, their own hopes. But in that simple apartment, in that rebuilt family, there was peace. Not the peace of an absence of problems, because problems would always exist, but the peace of knowing that, whatever happened, they would face it together. The peace of having chosen love over pride, truth over convenience, family over empire. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ryan and Sarah has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of reconstruction, of love that survives manipulation and time, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Was it Ryan's courage in confronting his father, Sarah's strength in surviving alone with 3 daughters, or the love that endured 6 years of separation? Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul and showing that it's always possible to start over, no matter how lost you feel. We'll see you in the next episode.